Greetings, YouTube philosophers. This is the 11th series of nonsense from The Logic of Sense by Gilles Deleuze. I find this to be a very difficult chapter. It reminds me of wrestling with a Zen koan. In this chapter, Deleuze will posit an intrinsic relation between sense and nonsense such that they have a mode of co-presence. However, he won't exactly say what this mode is, but he'll give hints. But first we need to start from the end of the last chapter on the series of the ideal game, where he was discussing the ion. And at the end of that chapter, he says that the ion is the straight line that separates, that's the border of the two series of words and things, or language and bodies. And it's also a border, but it's also a surface that connects the two. And across this surface, there's an aleatory point that's always circulating, a point of randomness or chance or uncertainty. And this aleatory point, he'll also call a paradoxical element. As we move into these series of nonsense, he'll say that this aleatory point, this paradoxical element, is a perpetuum mobile. It's always in motion, constantly moving. In the series we're talking about today, it's nonsense that is this paradoxical element that circulates between the two series. And the reason is that it's intended to make the two series communicate with each other, resonate with each other, possibly converge with each other, but also ramify, diverge, or be disjunctive from each other. And this chapter, besides introducing this concept of nonsense, tells us a lot of how Deleuze conceives of sense. For instance, he says that sense and nonsense do not have a relationship analogous to true and false. What would be the point of rising from a domain of true and false to a domain of sense if there was this relationship between sense and nonsense of true and false? Nonsense is not opposed to sense. Sense is always an effect, like an optical effect or a visual effect. He'll even go into scientific principles, the Kelvin effect. And so he'll want to name sense that's always produced by the constant circulation of a paradoxical element. He'll want to call that the Chrysippus effect, after the Stoic philosopher Chrysippus, or the Carroll effect. He'll start off using linguistics to try to explain his notion of nonsense. He'll go back to Carroll's esoteric words. He'll say that nonsense is a word that's both a word and a thing. He'll use the example of Snark. A snark is a mysterious name. It's also an invisible monster. He'll also throw in a third element into these two series, and that is the element of action, the hunt of the snark. The hunting of the snark is the action aspect of the snark example. And so he talks about two figures of nonsense. He goes into a great deal of analysis, linguistic analysis of nonsense, and he'll talk about two figures. One is the figure where it's a word, a nonsensical word is a word that communicates its own sense. And we can remember back from the series on propositions where a name that denotes something has a sense, but it's not in the actual statement or proposition, that you need to make a second proposition to state the sense of the first one. The sense of the second proposition needs to be stated by a third proposition. So there's a regressive aspect to it. I'll just give a quick example. If we make the statement, it is a very hot day today, that's saying something about temperature of the day or whatever, but the sense of it, it doesn't say what the sense of it is. And if I was to say, make another statement that I need to turn on the air conditioning and drink lots of liquids, that perhaps communicates some of the sense of the first statement. So words that are nonsense, that communicate their own sense, he's calling this a regressive synthesis. That's the first figure of nonsense. The second figure of nonsense he calls a disjunctive synthesis, and he illustrates that with portmanteau words. And the example he gives is frumious, which is a combination of the words furious and fuming. And he'll say that the virtual word communicates the sense of the other word. So, for instance, furious communicates the sense of fuming. Fuming communicates the sense of furious in this example. He's going to contrast nonsense with absurdity. Absurdity is opposed to sense. Something that's absurd means it has no sense. You'll end up by saying Carroll, not Camus, referring to Albert Camus and his philosophy of absurdism. So when he's breaking down linguistically how the relationship of sense to propositions and nonsense, he talks about determination of signification. So when, in the earlier example, when you denote something and then you need to make another statement to express the sense of what's denoted, he'll say that that needs to belong to a different class or property or type. He starts analyzing linguistics in this way. But when he gets back to talking about nonsense and saying how nonsense provides a donation of sense, such that sense kind of is independent of these determinations of types and properties of signification, that something can have absolutely no signification but have a sense. And he'll say that the two series that sense operates between, he now calls them the signifier and the signified. Sense affects both the signifier and the signified, the words or the things. Another important concept in this chapter holds that sense gets produced, that it's not an origin or a reserve or a reservoir. There's no big storehouse of it somewhere. It gets produced. Structure is a machine which produces sense, and the purpose of structuralism in philosophy and in any thought, he says, is to move frontiers. So that sort of gives a hint or a clue as to his intentions here with this. That when the idea of essences was starting to fail and the notion of sense was taking its place, that he won't say who, but people would say that sense was something transcendental coming from on high, from the heights. He abbreviates that as God, coming from God, or conversely, coming from man, from the depths. And you'll say that sense is neither, that it's a surface effect. That Nietzsche explored the surface with his aphorisms and poems. We do not seek in Freud an explorer of human depth and originary sense, rather the discovery of the machinery of the unconscious by means of which sense is produced, always as a function of nonsense. He concludes talking about nonsense by saying that nonsense is that which has no sense, and as such that it makes a donation of sense, nonsense is opposed to the absence of sense. He ends the chapter on a rather upbeat note, saying that the paradoxical element, the empty square as he calls it here, for neither man nor God, is something at the surface. Singularities which are neither general nor particular, neither personal nor universal. All of this is traversed by circulations, echoes, and events which produce more sense, more freedom, and more strength than man has ever dreamed of or God has ever conceived. Today's task is to make the empty square circulate, the paradoxical element, nonsense, circulate, and to make pre-individual and non-personal singularities speak. In other words, to produce sense. So for the esoteric side of things, I'm going to go back into his convoluted discussion of linguistics. Part of that, he's examining paradoxes and how they relate to signification. And he says, in this regard, let's look at how the Stoics connect propositions together, and he'll start to analyze that. And the esoteric part of it is the examples of the propositions that he takes, the connected propositions he borrows from the Stoics. And the first one is, if it is day, it is light. The second one is, if the woman has given birth, she has milk. I just thought those were interesting examples to use. He could have used any of them. And he goes into sort of a linguistic analysis of the properties of the two propositions and etc. Okay, munch on that, and we'll see you next time.